Why don't we get started? Good afternoon, everyone. We have people logging in right now. Just gonna give you a few more seconds. Thank you for joining us. I see a lot of familiar names. Oh yeah, everybody was waiting right at noon. Yep. A bunch of people joining. Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome again. Thank you for joining us during your lunch hour. We know most of you are working. I want to start with a quick reminder while people are logging in, just a quick reminder about some upcoming programs with SoCal ASLA. You can find all of these as well as registration information for all of them at socal-asla.org/events. And I'm going to paste that link in the chat. There we go. Coming up on September 25th, we have a tour of 2 community gardens with the nonprofit Cultiva LA. They are a nonprofit that is reimagining urban community gardens to address scarcity of nature, places to recreate, and lack of access to fresh produce in underserved communities in Los Angeles. On September 30th, we have a reception and presentation of the chapter's Quality of Life Design Awards program. This year with the theme, The Growing Importance of Outdoors. You can find that one as well on the website in the link I just posted. And finally, November 19th through 22nd is the conference on landscape architecture with ASLA in Nashville, Tennessee. You can find information and registration for that national conference on our National Society website, which is just asla.org. And if you're not a member, we invite you to join us. Your membership is what keeps programs like this growing. It's what keeps our advocacy efforts in Washington, D.C. and Sacramento going. And we can't do it without you. Student membership is free. So if you're a student, please just, all you have to do is go to asla.org and sign up for a free membership. We have a refreshing and stimulating program today to help you get through your workday. Today, we are trying a new program called a midday conversation. This is something that we're trying to put a spotlight on our members. 2 of our members will be paired up during these sessions to have a casual conversation about current events, relevant topics in landscape architecture, as well as to share some of their common ground that they have covered throughout their careers. In addition, during each session, we will invite one of our featured members to highlight an organization of their choice, whose mission is aligned with their professional interests, in order to amplify that organization's work. Attendees can choose to make voluntary donations to support the work of this organization by using the link provided in the registration information. We will have about 30 to 40 minutes of discussion during which you can write your questions using the Q&A feature found at the bottom of your screen. And you can feel free to post your comments on the chat throughout the conversation. Our speakers can see your comments and your questions as well. This event will be recorded and posted to our website. So with that, I would like to, it'll be a really great pleasure to introduce our 2 speakers today. Kelly Comras is a fellow of the American Society of Landscape Architects and a member of the State Bar of California. Her landscape architectural practices focus on community-based open space design, research, and publication in the field of cultural landscape. She is a founding member of the Cultural Landscape Foundation's Stewardship Council, past president of the California Garden and Landscape History Society, and she chaired the editorial board for the journal Eden. She lectures at institutions such as Harvard Graduate School of Design, Society of Architectural Historians, California Preservation Foundation, and others. Her book about Ruth Shellhorn was released in 2016. Her recent book review of Vision and Place about John Wesley Powell's impact on resources and development in the Southwest was published in Landscape Architecture magazine in June 2021. And we also have with us today Claire Latane. Claire is a writer, community advocate, and ecological designer. She's an assistant professor of landscape architecture at Cal Poly Pomona. Claire practiced landscape architecture with EPT design and Studio MLA for 15 years. She applies landscape architecture and neuroscience research, connecting designed environments with mental health, safety, and positive physical and social outcomes to create healthier school and community environments. Her book, Schools That Heal, Design with Mental Health in Mind, was released by Island Press in June 2021. This work began with support of the Landscape Architecture Foundation, the Association for Women in Architecture Foundation, the Prevention Institute, and Cal Poly Pomona's Department of Landscape Architecture. Claire is a founding member of the Los Angeles Living Schoolyard Coalition, and she founded the Collaborative for Healthy and Inclusive Learning Environments. And with that, I am going to hand it over to Kelly and begin our program.
Thank you, Carlos, and thank you, Vicky Filippi, for setting all of this up and all the tech support. We really appreciate it. I want to let you know, to start with, why we're here, why me, why Claire Latane. Claire and I met just a few years ago, never knowing beforehand that we had both graduated from Cal Poly Pomona, Claire in 2006 and I in 1980. The program was begun by John Lyle, who I knew pretty well, and the Cal Poly Pomona's Lyle Center for Regenerative Studies is named after him. John Lyle saw very early on that landscape architecture was growing to be a much bigger tent that had been, in the mid-century era. And he started the master's program in order to bring in people from different disciplines. I had come in through political science and then went on to study law. Claire had come in through journalism. And I think he was just prescient in seeing that the field was going to need a lot of input from different disciplines in order to make it a very effective profession as times were changing. So I think that cross-pollination that he envisioned has turned out to be really helpful. Neither Claire nor I, and I suspect many of the watchers today on this, really anticipated that they would end up practicing the practice they do today, especially the ones who were trained earlier on, in the 70s and 80s, and maybe even 90s. Claire and I met about 10 years ago when she learned that I was working on a book and she had been a journalist. And so we came together over our interest in working in the profession, partly as writers, trying to put forth ideas and engage in conversations with our colleagues. And now Claire has come out with this new book, and we've been paired because I wrote a book and Claire wrote a book. We're both women in landscape architecture. We both went to Cal Poly Pomona. And so I think, there are these parallels, but clearly there are a lot of differences as well. We focused on very different areas of the profession. And Claire has gone from being a studio landscape architect and bringing the journalism with her to now become a scholar and an author. So the first thing I want to ask you, Claire, is, did you plan all this? Or if not, how did it come to be?
Thanks, Kelly, and welcome everyone. It's so good to see some familiar faces or names in the audience. It's a really good question. While I didn't plan my path at all, I did have in the back of my mind when I started landscape architecture graduate school that I wanted to learn everything I could about it in order to write for newspapers and magazines. I was really frustrated when I finally did learn about landscape architecture relatively late. I was already in my 30s, that I hadn't been seeing anything about it in the news. And being a news junkie, I felt like this was a gap that was really important to fill. So when I went to graduate school at Cal Poly Pomona, I thought I'll learn about it and then fill that gap and write stories and articles to teach the general public about these nature-based, solution-oriented approach to some of our worst environmental crises. And then during graduate school, I just fell in love with the profession. Very quickly after I graduated, I went through a divorce and was a single mother, and practicing filled a lot of needs in my life at that time, including just getting to be a part of a discipline that I thought was such an important one and undervalued one in our world. And through my practice, I actually did bring a lot of that writing and communication skill into the studios that I worked for. That allowed me to write press releases and articles for the work that we were doing on our practice, but it also gave me a way to do advocacy for the general public. And then, shortly after I started practicing in 2006, we went through the Great Recession. And so during those few years, we went through sort of we cut our hours at EPT Design in order to keep as many people employed as possible during that recession. And I branched out in order to try to maintain some job stability into writing for Landscape Architecture magazine and teaching for Cal Poly Pomona. So the road to becoming an academic full-time was sort of a slow process and very much organic. During my fellowship through the Landscape Architecture Foundation, I knew that I wanted to delve deeper into this topic of designing schools to support mental health and well-being, but I didn't really have in mind that I would be doing a complete career transformation. And then Island Press invited me to write a book on it. And I sort of was trying to figure out, this was my dream come true, this invitation. And I was trying to figure out how to do that while working full-time. As anyone knows in practice, that's you're sort of on call all the time in a lot of cases. And so when the opportunity came to teach, I jumped on it, and it was just really good timing, sort of luck, and in some ways to get a full-time job at Cal Poly Pomona.
I'm going to support what Claire says, because I know that when I first began contemplating the writing of a book, I'd be at a cocktail party and say something like that, and someone would jump in and go, "Oh yeah, I've always wanted to write a book too. I think I'm going to take the summer off sometime and do it." And I myself thought, oh, a book has, say, 10 chapters, and so it'll be like writing 10 term papers. You write one every few months and then you have a book. I didn't know that that wasn't true. And my husband, who's an academic, said, "Well, you've done all the research. Why don't you just write the book?" So I thought, this is going to be, pretty straightforward. Obviously, any author that's in the audience, Claire and I agree with you, that's not the way it works at all. It's a much more arduous process. And I think when you write a book, you write a draft of the book, and then you write the visual aspects of the book, and then your editor rewrites the book. And so you really have at least 3 books by the time you've done that, and all of the hiccups that go along the way. Claire, in your book, you did talk a little bit about your own childhood experience with schools, and then what your children experienced. And it sounds like it was pretty influential in pushing you in this direction. So can you tell our listeners how that happened?
Sure. So, I'm going to age myself here, which is fine with me. I grew up in the 70s, which was a really progressive time in terms of environmental issues, but also education. So I was really lucky to go to a public program that offered an informal education. So for instance, in elementary school, we had teachers who were artists, painters, musicians, but we also had a curriculum that was open and student-centered, in a way that where you weren't given homework, for instance. I don't think I had a shred of homework until I entered middle school or maybe even high school. That allowed me to do whatever I wanted to in elementary school. We were encouraged to follow our passions. So I spent the majority of my first grade year, for instance, behind my teacher's chair at her bookshelf, reading every single book I could get my hands on. And needless to say, by the time my children went to school, we were living in Los Angeles. And not only were we in a very different context than the Midwestern town I had grown up in, Midwestern city, but the education context was very different. I had a lot of resources. A lot of us who went to public school, I'm sure some of our attendees are around my age and remember this as well. There we had band and orchestra and actual art teachers teaching from elementary school through high school, and after school programs, and all free. And for my children, they didn't have an art teacher. They didn't have a dedicated music teacher. They had their school environments were very harsh. My son, who probably needed it the most, needed to be outdoors and sort of free the most, always tended to end up in the portable classrooms with no windows. It was like the worst of the worst situations. And then, of course, their play yard in elementary school was all asphalt. And then moving into middle and high school, it didn't improve much. The campus might have had more trees and green space, but they weren't necessarily encouraged to use those spaces. And it was while my youngest was still in elementary school that I first really dove into this subject. In 2009, when I was teaching at Cal Poly Pomona, I taught a studio in the for the fourth year bachelor program that was focused on Eagle Rock Elementary School, where my children went to school. And our students at Cal Poly Pomona worked with the second and third graders at Eagle Rock to reimagine their school grounds. And that actually became a model for what I'm teaching now in the master's program, and for the collaborative as well. So the contradiction, though, or the contrast in experience, I don't think that the younger generations today, and it'd be interesting to hear from the audience, maybe even with hands raised, like after the 90s, or actually the 70s, there were huge budget cuts in California and across the country in education. And there recently, last week, the 21st Century Schools Fund put out a report stating that, and they do this every year, stating that the school facilities budget shortfalls are $85 billion per year. And that is just an example of how behind we are in supporting our schools, even just in terms of upkeep and maintenance, let alone progressive programs.
Claire, yeah, I think all of us are pretty familiar with, especially those of us who are a little older, what halcyon days there were in public schooling here in California. You mentioned also at one point, having worked with Mia Lehrer, Mia several years ago, quite famously and courageously came out and disclosed that she had been a parent for years, raising her children quietly because she really didn't want to be what she was concerned might be discrimination against herself as a parent, and what opportunities might be limited were people to know that she was committed to raising her children and all. And I'm just wondering, how did that work for you? You've mentioned that you had kids, you were raising them alone. How did you manage this? Were you able to pull it off, do you think?
Well, they all survived and they're adults, so I did pull it off miraculously enough. But I think, this is where having leaders like Mia before me sort of paving the way, even if behind the scenes probably helped a little bit. But also I came into landscape architecture already having children. So they were a big impetus for me studying the discipline, and they were always very much in the forefront of my my values and principles, design principles. So from the beginning, even during work interviews and through my work at both studios, I was very transparent about my role as a mother and how that informed my design values, my design decisions, and how it informed my my work schedule. So I was very fortunate at EPT Design. Actually, I landed there in part because of their family-focused approach to employee health. At the time, and I think they still do this, they don't require you to work 50, 60 hours a week. They actually give you compensation time or extra pay if you work over 40 or 45 hours a week. They did at the time. And that was a really important signifier of valuing family. And during, after my divorce, which happened within the first year I started working there, they allowed me to flex my schedule. So when I had the children, I was able to take shorter hours and work longer hours the weeks I didn't have the children, which was really phenomenal. It probably made the difference between whether I could stay in the profession or not, frankly.
Okay. I want to kind of move along to your book a little bit now, because I know our clock is ticking. You discussed in your book these design strategies. What I found in reading your book is that you introduced the concept and ideas of what you were trying to accomplish, but it was also a very pragmatic book. It had specific ideas, specific directions, specific guidance as to how to make these ideas come to fruition. For instance, in chapter 3, you were discussing site design strategies that included both small and large physical changes that would support mental health, safety, and well-being. So can you tell us a little bit about those, and what's the difference between a big and a small change?
Yeah, this was one of the many contributions of my brilliant editor, Courtney Licks, who, at that chapter, probably because in some ways I was closest to it, the design strategies, being a designer, that was the hardest to structure and organize in a way that the audience could understand. And at some point, I knew I had always planned on including some things you can do for free or very low cost. For instance, asking students what they want doesn't really require any resources other than time and the will. And, actually it helps a lot to understand community-led design strategies. But at some point along the draft process, and in this case, as I'm sure a lot of authors experience, there were probably like 5 drafts, not one, not one, and then a final. Courtney suggested, why don't we organize the design strategies according to how much money it would cost, or what you could do tomorrow versus a year from now versus 10 years. So we ended up organizing them according to simple shifts in thinking. What could you achieve for free with just thinking about things differently? And then what can you do for a small amount of investment? And then what
examples? Could you give us an example of a low cost and an expensive?
Sure. I mean, the inclusive design is a shift in thinking, definitely. A shift in thinking might includes teaching teachers to uncover windows, their classroom windows, so that students can actually see the trees outside if they're lucky enough to have trees outside, instead of this myth that all eyes must be on a teacher for them to be reaching the students. You know, students do better in terms of stress and actually in terms of academic success if they can see trees and gardens outside their classroom windows. That's a free example of a shift in thinking. A low-cost solution might be making sure there are enough chairs in a lunchroom or outside in an outdoor cafeteria area. Providing rocking chairs and swivel chairs and things that allow students to engage their bodies, and teachers, which is really important for mental and physical health. And then an example of, planting trees is relatively low cost as well. And then deeper examples would be transforming a campus by revealing natural systems. A lot of our schools are built on floodplains or old stream corridors or marshes or fault zones because, frankly, because the land was cheap. So if you can work at a deeper level, at a more contextual level, to understand what systems were running through your campus and reveal those, that might be an example of a deeper, long-lasting, more expensive transformation. And in addition to any building changes, this book also includes architectural solutions, interior solutions, and community-wide solutions too.
You know, you're reminding me, Ruth Shellhorn, the woman I wrote my book about, the landscape architect, she was the planner for the campus at UC Riverside. And when they started, the property is intersected with all of these arroyos. The university was just going to fill them in and then use them for parking lots because, you know, that was what they wanted to do. And she spent a huge amount of time lobbying against that and won in the end. And so the campus is intersected by these arroyos, and it does indeed take students longer to get to class because they have to walk down and then up or around them. But it's also one of the most spectacular features on the campus, and it does feel like you're in a kind of a rural park when you're there. So I can understand what you're talking about how it does change the atmosphere, the learning environment for the students and all.
Yeah, it also changes the well-being. It supports mental health and well-being and ability to learn. There's Francis Kuo at University of Illinois did research showing that students that walk to school down tree-covered streets do better in school, especially with ADHD, than students who walk to school along sidewalks that don't have trees. That simple shift. So
that part of your book, because I noticed that you, instead of just issuing these statements like students do better in tree-lined streets, then you also cited the research that supported those ideas, so that it didn't just sound, like you pulled it out of the air. It based a lot of the decisions that you made in the book on research. And that was another thing I wanted to ask you about, was equity. You talked a lot in your book about equity and how to design for it. And, I find that a rather squishy notion. So I was wondering if you might address that, how you design for equity.
It's an interesting word. It is kind of a squishy notion because it's pretty broad. Equity can mean making sure that the schools and communities that are most underfunded or underparked, in terms of like parked as in green parks, not parking spaces, get attention, get transformation first. It can mean that that we design school environments and learning environments to be culturally relevant to the students that attend those schools, and accessible. Equity means universal design principles as well as equitable distribution of funding and other resources. So I think from, while it feels conceptual, there are very concrete strategies in order to approach equity. And while a lot of the solutions that are shared here in Schools That Heal are site specific per school, a lot of them are meant to be thought of as district-wide or city-wide or county-wide solutions. And there's a lot of focus on collaborating with government agencies and nonprofits that can help us do those things, like try to reverse some of the inequities that plague our systems, including education, especially education.
So your book is really advocating not just for physical design, but social, political, cultural design awareness. Is that correct? Did I have that right, what you're saying?
Yeah, I think that you can't really separate the two, because policy informs design and design informs, public health.
You
And
talked about interdependence between schools and the community. Is that what you meant by that, trying to develop this interdependent, community relationship to support those ideas?
yeah, that's part of it. Definitely thinking about schools as a community resource, but also the responsibility of the community. And there is, like a lot of the topics in this book, there are layers to this. There is a growing movement in this country and others towards a community school model, which basically means that in addition to education, schools provide other resources because they're naturally spread out through communities and cities and regions, even in rural areas. They're pretty uniformly spread out and relatively accessible to most community members. So if you're already spread out like that, it's like these decentralized local overlapping systems that we talk a lot about in the Cal Poly Pomona MLA program as regenerative design, resilient design strategies. If you think about all of those schools being able to reach the vast majority of communities, it's a no-brainer really to think of them as, in addition to teaching our students, why don't we provide health services? LA Unified, for instance, has 12 high schools where they added wellness centers that are open to students and the community. Healthy food.
I'm sorry, let me interrupt. By wellness centers, are you saying that these are functioning somewhat like clinics?
Yeah, exactly. They provide medical, dental, and mental health services to the community.
I remember in fourth grade, all of the kids in our elementary school were given the polio vaccine on campus.
Mm-hmm.
So that sort of thing would be highly unlikely today. But I do recall that there used to be that sort of connection.
Yeah, and often, I think it's not unusual for schools still. Like when I was growing up, we had scoliosis screenings. There were dental screenings. It's kind of a natural place to make sure that one of our most vulnerable populations are being taken care of. Mm-hmm. But in addition to services like health and education, you can also think of them as community building places and places where people can go in emergencies, and also places where you can really add informal mentorship for students. Like, we have an aging population with the baby boomers reaching retirement age, and there are not enough places for that aging population to go live away from their home, and they want to stay in their homes. They often want to stay in their homes and their community. So how can we take all of that energy and knowledge and wisdom and time that this aging generation has, that our elders have, and bring them into our schools to provide informal mentorship, guidance, career training, advice, adopted grandparents? That's a win for the students and the senior citizens and the community.
Mm-hmm.
there are plenty of models across the country of school districts that actually give tax breaks for senior volunteers. So there's some interesting precedents there to look at.
Carlos mentioned in the introduction this organization that you initiated, the Collaborative for Healthy and Inclusive Learning Environments, which you call Chile, and you founded that through the Lyle Center for Regenerative Studies. And can you tell me how you came to form that organization and what its goals are?
Sure. This is such an exciting initiative for me because it really ties in a few different things I've been working on for a while now. One is that school design studio model that began in 2009 with Eagle Rock Elementary School. And that studio actually ended up inspiring a $349,000 grant through the California State Natural Resources Department, a Prop 84 grant.
This is one of the templates in your book, right? For
how yeah, Eagle Rock Elementary is shared there. And more recently, we've been working with a couple of schools in Pasadena Unified School District that have gotten grants as well because we connect those schools to local nonprofits to write grant applications and manage that process. So that's one inspiration. I wanted a sort of a more formalized means of, I actually wanted to share that model because I know a lot of faculty around the country, not just designers, who want to work with schools and improve communities. So we're looking at Chile as a place where we can share, faculty in any discipline can share syllabi and curriculum and do workshops on how to do thoughtful and sensitive community-led design processes, and highlight case studies on the Chile website, but also a place where we can raise money to support community youth in becoming organizers themselves. So when we work with schools, we're asking the K through 12 students to do a lot of thinking work for us. And as we develop this program, my colleague Jean Yang is teaching at University of Oregon this year, and she and I are co-teaching a studio. She with youth in Portland who are experiencing homelessness, and me with schools in Los Angeles. And we were trying to figure out, how do we support the youth that we're asking to help us with this community-led design process? And of course, the obvious way is to provide funding. So Chile will provide a formal framework in order for us to receive donations, grant money, and then support not just high school students and college students, but also faculty who are doing a lot of the thought leadership work and don't necessarily have a full-time position or a stable umbrella to work within. I'm going to mute for a second while the trash truck goes by.
Okay, I'll talk for a minute while you're muted. I think, we're getting towards the end of our time here. So, I'm just going to make an observation, which I started with at the beginning of this talk, which is that this profession of ours has become a very different profession. When I first started, the ultimate goal of almost all of my classmates was to be able to be Frederick Law Olmsted, designing homes and parks and the Sylvan, vision of America. And I know that Frederick Law Olmsted really looked at Central Park as providing many of the same values that we're discussing today. But I think there's much more nitty-gritty involved now. Claire has been talking about all of these skills that are needed. When students come to me and ask me, what's available in this profession? Is this really a good profession? And I see us as a huge umbrella, I often advocate that they go ahead and take writing classes and go ahead and join Toastmasters so that they can stand up and say something for 5 minutes to advocate for whatever it is that they're working on. So much of the work we do now involves advocacy of one sort or another, and being able to articulate ideas that sometimes are vague to other people and they haven't fully thought through themselves, and helping them sort through some of the pros and cons, and then help persuade them to move to ideas such as the ones that Claire is putting forth in her book. So, and I could go on and on for hours about all of the different skills. I mean, we come into this profession now as engineers and artists, and so much more so than we did in the past 40, 50 years ago.
Yeah, I think that an important thing to note too, because we have, you know, a good mix of professionals and students in our audience today. It's really important for our professionals to make room for listening, because our profession and the conversations that are happening in our college and university programs, in our K through 12 communities, are groundbreaking, and it's changing the profession every day as we speak. And part of that is acknowledging that some of the leaders and founders of our profession, like Frederick Law Olmsted, also did a lot of harm to the communities where they worked. And we, so in a university at Cal Poly Pomona, our students have been working really closely with us to figure out what are the new skills and what are the new understandings that we really need to promote in order to achieve equity, and not just, you know, environmental justice and social justice today, but rectifying generational trauma that has happened in our communities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, Landscape Architecture Magazine is a good example, I think, of, you know, an entity that is trying to, you know, bring a lot of these issues forward, and trying to aggregate from so many different professions how those different disciplines might impact our own profession.
Yeah, and all that to say that for students, there's so much to learn from people like you, Kelly, who have been through quite a few different career paths yourself, career transformations yourself. But there's also so much that our students can teach the older generations, the more senior landscape architects and faculty. So I think it's really important to just put that out there, that like I include myself sort of midway between these two generations, because I was a late to come student, and you know, even though I guess I'm officially middle-aged now, I still am very much aligned with our students and their mission to change the profession. But I also have some experience, and I think there's some real back and forth in mentorship that needs to happen there, and it can only happen if our for lack of a better term, senior landscape architecture professionals learn how to listen to not just the communities that they're working with, but also their employees that are coming right out of school now, because it's a very different conversation.
Yeah, I think with experience, what comes with it is a burden of knowing what can't be done. And that's a real albatross to have to carry. And I think it takes a real conscious effort to remove that and turn around and say, okay, well, what can be done? And stop saying, well, we can't do that because our past has taught us many times that it can't be done. But it's worth saying, I think, that that listening is a good idea.
Mm-hmm. And knowing that and knowing that when the context changes, the opportunities for what can be done change a lot.
Yeah. I'm looking at the clock now and seeing that we were supposed to turn to Carlos and say, do we have any questions that we need to address?
We do have, I'm looking at Kate with your hand up. Is your hand up intentionally? Do you have a question that you want to ask? I believe that the way this is set up, we need to ask questions through the chat or the Q&A. Is that right?
I see a question here from Brian. It says, what are the opportunities you see here in LA for policy change around school greening? Claire, that's for you.
Yeah, Brian, so many, right? He knows. I'm working with a coalition of nonprofits around this very topic. There are, as in a lot of gigantic school districts, but also the smaller school districts that make up LA County and the region. There are a few different areas that we're working on the policy change. One is access to schools, allowing access to schools when they're closed to community members and students and families. It's like free park space, almost free. I mean, they want to be managed, right? But it's as soon as you start opening school grounds to communities after hours, you really increase the places where people can go to recreate. And that became, it's always been an issue, right? But it's over COVID-19 that the inequities of park access became really heightened. Another area is how do we teach teachers and reframe some of our educational policies? A dear friend and colleague of mine that I've been working with for years now, starting with Eagle Rock Elementary, Dr. Marcella Rainey at Occidental College, studies student physical activity and social behavior. And she's an expert, she's in the kinesiology department and an expert in physical education. And the way we teach physical education today is very prescriptive and based on competitive athletics. And yet her research and a lot of other research shows that it's more nature-based play and exploration, things like climbing trees, rolling around on the grass or doing gymnastics and things like that can be much more healthy for developing a long-term habit of physical activity. So we have to work with the district and the state in that case to rewrite what physical education standards there are. And that in turn informs what we can do on school grounds. Right now we have high schools, most high schools, not all of them, have about 50% of their grounds given over to competitive sports like football fields, basketball courts. A lot of people rely on those and depend on sports to stay healthy mentally and physically, but not all students use them. And I think only like 1% of our high school students will go on to play college sports, and like 2% of them will go on to play professional sports. So the idea that we're giving 50% of our high school campuses to sports, for instance, you might want to rethink that and see how that could be more of a community responsibility or a shared resource. Maybe one high school has sports equipment and another one has a whole series of music studios, or there are some things to think about that way too, in terms of policy. And then the biggest one probably that we can do as landscape architects is, why are we not seeing more schools and districts working in alignment with the LA County Sustainability Plan, for instance, the city goals and state goals for green infrastructure? We can help be that bridge between schools and school districts and the local agencies that have these really progressive plans in order to help let the school be a hub or a center where green infrastructure and low impact development strategies and mitigating air pollution through tree canopy, all of those things sort of could center around schools where students spend the majority of their days.
Do we have any other questions? Thank you, Claire.
Mm-hmm. And Brian, if you have ideas too, I'm always looking for ideas. So You know, a lot of who I'm seeing in our audience, Bianca Koenig is working in an engineering firm. That's such a good opportunity, and a leader there. There's probably so many opportunities that a lot of you can come up with that I'd love to hear about, that you're seeing in your own communities and your own regions. So I'm sure that we can share my email address. I'm happy to take suggestions and share resources as you need them.
I'd say then one of the takeaway messages from today's conversation is that as designers, as we're going out into the community and working, it sounds to me like you're really advocating for going in with a very wide view, whether we're working on a school or a commercial project or a park, is to expand the view of what inclusiveness might mean for the success of those projects, more than just the brief that we're given, so that the roots that these projects can put into the ground, and no pun intended, all over the community is an opportunity to be examined.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of advocacy, it used to be, even when I started practicing in 2006, it feels like it was less common to really think about our profession as an advocacy profession, unless you went into it specific through in our program at Cal Poly Pomona, as you know, Kelly, and Carlos went through it as well, and so did Brian. And Lorena was there while I was there. So a lot of us go into that program to become advocates, to strengthen our advocacy, the advocacy that we're already doing. And there are a handful of graduate students in our program right now that are on this call. And I think most of them, when they have come in the last few years, have a very strong vision to be advocates for climate resilience, for community health, for environmental justice. And I would love to know if that's common around the country or if that's unique to Cal Poly Pomona. I don't know, it's more of a question or a thought, but I think it's becoming much more common, and landscape architecture as a connector discipline is a natural. It's a natural place for advocates to end up, because we do get to work with, we can work in government agencies like Carlos and Lorena, or we can work with in private firms and make change through design, or we can teach and educate. And in addition, we're working among all of these disciplines that we can also help inform and educate. And I know, Nate, you're on this call. It'd be interesting to, or in the audience, firms like Nate's work at Rios and extends beyond the studio, what's happening in the studio, to really look at how you can advocate for healthier environments on places like Cal Poly Pomona campuses or other universities. And maybe that's just the people that, that sort of are, maybe the people that are thinking about these things are just happen to be on this call, but like Ronnie's work with climate change and ASLA. I think every single person here in our audience is probably doing more, really important work in this realm of advocacy. So Brian asked about the coalition and the links. We have a link that's live now for fundraising for our coalition, and we expect to have a website up in the next 2 to 4 weeks. So what you can do, if you're interested, Carlos, could you put my email in the chat? If you're interested in the coalition, in the collaborative, or are you thinking about the Coalition for Living Schoolyards, Brian? The Collaborative for Healthy and Inclusive Learning Environments, Chile. If you want to be on our mailing list, just send me an email and ask to be on our mailing list. And then the Los Angeles Living Schoolyards Coalition is working on a policy brief and report that should be coming out sometime this fall. So you will all probably be hearing about that soon. and ways to support it.
Thank you, Claire. Carlos, thank you for the opportunity for us to be able to speak with you today. Claire, it was a pleasure to talk with you. Thank you again.
Thank you both for your time and for letting us be a fly on the wall in this discussion. Very relevant topics. Thank you again. And to our attendees, if you would like this program and if you would like to see more similar programs, please let us know. We would love to hear your feedback. I'm going to paste a link here where you can let us know what you thought, if you want to see more like this, and if you have anybody in mind that you would like us to feature next time. Thank you all for your time and have a great rest of your day.
Kelly, thank you so much for agreeing to take this on with me.
It's a pleasure, and it gave me an excuse to read your book, so thank you.
And thanks, Carlos and Vicki, for organizing. Carlos, you've been such a big
Yes.
support here.
Thank you,
so
Vicki,
much.
who is Vicki's behind the curtains running Zoom for us. Thank you so much for your help.
I'll see you all later or soon.
Take care.